Hi, I'm Miyagi, a top 500 cycle main, and this is an in-depth guide to buildings for cycle players or just anyone who wants to understand the game better. Let's get into it. So I think the first thing that's important to understand is why are buildings used in cycle in the first place? Now there's a few reasons for this, and the first one is to lock down defense. Buildings allow much more consistent defenses against building targeting troops, such as the currently controversial Hog Rider, of course, as well as other stuff like Golem, Balloon, etc. And now the second reason is that for cycle in particular, you're able to get down 2 buildings on defense, which is really good because if something happens to the first, which would normally be something like a spell taking out your building, but can also be something like a golem slowly taking it out or whatever, you'll be able to get back to a second building which will cover you. And that basically keeps you super safe. And there's more reasons than this, but the last one I want to mention is that distract cards like Skeletons and Ice Spirit have really good synergy with buildings, and that helps you get the max value possible from using a building. So yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way. I think it's good to understand why you're even using a building at all. Now I want to move on to the technical details so you can really understand how these buildings work. Now I'm not going to go over every building in the game, but there's 3 different categories that each building can fall into. The first is small buildings, which are basically just Tesla and Goblin Drill. The second group is called active buildings, and these are buildings that shoot a projectile. And the third group is passive buildings, such as a Goblin Hut or Elixir Pump. They just kind of sit there. Now the one thing that is really important to know is that these 3 groups each have their own hitboxes, which you'll see on the screen. Now this difference in hitbox size has a ton of small differences, which I'll go into detail in another video. But the one thing that matters the most for buildings specifically is that a bigger hitbox will pull troops from further away, which will be really important when I go over the placement soon. Now I want to mention that normally Cycle usually uses one of the first 2 types of buildings, but sometimes passive buildings are used too, such as Goblin Hut is kind of popular right now and used with pigs a lot, but for the most part, the first 2 building types. Next I'll just very briefly go over the specific placements for each building. For small buildings like the Tesla, the default placement for most building targeting troops is just 3 tiles from the river in the center. For anti-earthquake and lightning, you want to place it 1 tile from the river in the center. And against Balloon or other air cards, you want to place it 1 tile to the side wherever the air card is, and at least 3 tiles down, because if you only place it 2 tiles down, then your other tower won't help, which will be really a lot worse for killing stuff like the Balloon. So I want to emphasize that, make sure it's at least 3 tiles down. Now for active buildings, the default placement is in the opposite lane over here, as you can see. But if you're going for something that's on the outside of the arena, as you can see here, you might have to place it a tile to the side, so that's a little closer. And for anti-earthquake, it's a little bit more complex. You have to place it in the opposite lane and push it with the troop. So this does take a little bit of practice, but it's really good to know that this is an option, otherwise you'll just keep getting earthquake predicted over and over. And against Balloon, there's a couple different placements, but they're all really important, so I want to go over them. The first one is if they place the Balloon close to the bridge on the side over here, which you'll see is different from another placement later. You can just go with the same one like with the Hog Rider. But, and this part is really important, if they place it further back like this, you actually have to place the bomb tower or tile to the side. And this placement is still good because your other tower will still help kill the Balloon. And the last placement I want to mention, but it's still really important against Balloon, is up here near the river. And this placement's really good because even if the Balloon is placed all the way back like it was in the last example, it'll still pull it, and oftentimes if you have like a musketeer cycled in the back going down the opposite lane, it'll also help out here, which is really important to know. And last, for passive buildings, I'm not going to go over it too much since it's not really used in Cycle, but the placements for most of it is pretty much the same as the last example. However, for the anti-earthquake placement, if you're against Hog, you won't have to push the cards, so you can just place it like normal, so that's a little easier. Now those are just the really important placements to know, and I didn't want to go over absolutely everything because it wouldn't really fit the length of this video. But if you have any more questions about specific things, feel free to ask down in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer. Now I just want to go over some extra general advice that I think is really important to know about buildings. Now the first thing I want to mention is another thing that's just super important, honestly not even just for buildings but in general, but something that you can really take advantage of with buildings specifically is that you always want to try and drag things into both of your towers when it's possible. In the previous section I mentioned this a little bit against the Balloon, but an example of this is that placing the Tesla 2 tiles from the river is way worse than placing the Tesla 3 tiles from the river against the Balloon. And the reason for this is, like I just mentioned, because 2 tiles from the river will not drag it into your second tower's range, but 3 tiles will. And I can 100% guarantee you that over the course of many games, that difference can definitely lose you games. And of course, that same principle applies for both of the other building types as well. So always try and drag things into both of your tower's range. And the second piece of advice I want to mention is that buildings have way more creative usage than what I said in the previous section. And everything I mentioned in that previous section you want to take with a huge grain of salt. You should never take what I say literally because everything can change depending on the situation. Now some examples of using buildings that you might not have thought of are placing buildings super low late game to increase your building's survivability, and then you drag stuff into the center and just take advantage of its DPS. Since, for example, if they don't have a big spell, they won't be able to kill your building. So it's kind of like you have a 3rd tower there. And in this example, you can expand off of the default Tesla placement that I mentioned earlier, because that placement works if a unit is going down the middle. So if the unit is going down its tile to the inside, you can also move your Tesla tile away and it'll still work. So if you just think a little harder about this kind of stuff, you can figure out new ideas that you hadn't thought of before. So just always be on the lookout for that kind of thing. And the last thing I want to mention is something that's a little bit more complex, but placing a building can be a really good way of building up elixir on the board and helping support your offense. Now a pretty obvious unique property of buildings is that they don't move. And what that means is that if you place a building and your opponent doesn't kill it quickly, that's just more elixir you have on the board, which is something really beneficial, which you'll see in an example later. And lastly, I just want to go over some practical examples so that you can see what this looks like in-game and see all this stuff applied. So this first example here is going to show you what I'm talking about with building up elixir on the board. So here my opponent goes Evil Bats, and I take this opportunity to place my Tesla high near the river, which also kills his Magic Archer. And what's important here is that my Tesla takes no damage, so it's going to survive for a long time. And it's also near the river, so it'll be able to help out with offense. And that Tesla that I originally used for defense kills a Fire Spirit, Wall Breakers, and some Bats, which over the course of its whole lifespan is a ton of value. And you can see here that Tesla was basically the key piece that managed to close out this game for me, which could have been potentially kind of rough if that hadn't happened. And this example is using Expo, right? And I imagine a concern some people could have is that this only works with Expo, but that's definitely not true. And with other cycle decks like Hog EQ and potentially 2.9 Balloon, if you place your building at the top near the center, it can be really helpful to have that just zone out the area so that your opponent can't place any buildings there. But even though this might be more helpful with Expo than some other decks, it's definitely still something that's useful for a lot of other decks as well. In this next example, I'm up against Mega Knight Prince, and it's triple elixir, which means it's basically hopeless to get a lock, so I just lock that on defense and place a low defensive Expo. And then here you can see I placed the Tesla in a little bit of a weird spot. And the reason for that is because I don't want to place it in the center so that I can drag all his troops into the center and just use the Tesla for DPS pretty much. So you can see everything gets dragged to the center here, and you can see my buildings and my archers just DPS down all his troops, which is really good. The Prince does get a hit, but that's okay because it's on my strong tower, so that was pretty much within the plan. And here I just set up the Tesla in the center like normal, I probably could have placed it a little lower like before, but it's fine because there's still enough room in the center. And also this was last season pre-Mega Knight nerf, so nowadays this defense would be a little easier. And here at the end, just to keep it super safe, I go with the Evil Tesla instead of the Knight, because the Knight would get knocked back by the Mega Knight, which could introduce some risk, but the Tesla's a building, so that won't happen, so just making sure things are completely safe. And it gets really tight here in the end, but luckily I had slightly more damage. But yeah, in this matchup, the big thing here is that since they don't have a big spell, it's a good idea to place your buildings really low and just keep them away from the center, so that they don't just die to the Mega Knight and the Prince and all that spam. That's it for this video, thanks for watching and subscribe for more.